In the sweltering heat of South Carolina, 1808, they say death comes quietly in the night. But what if it came crawling, unseen, unheard, slithering beneath the sheets, fangs poised, venom dripping? A man named Cato, enslaved yet unbroken, discovered a new weapon. Imagine a vengeance with no blade, no gun, no torch, only scales and 8 legs, moving in silence, striking in sleep. This is not a tale of open rebellion, of firebrands and chains shattering under the moonlight. No, this is something far more chilling. An enslaved man, bound by oppression, found nature itself to be his accomplice. Venomous snakes and deadly spiders became his silent army, slipping into bedrooms where cruelty once reigned, delivering justice in the most terrifying way possible. Welcome to Echoes of Truth, where the bravest souls gather to uncover the shadows history tried to bury. Tonight I ask you, do you have the courage to walk with me into this tale of poison and power, where myths and records blur into one chilling legacy? Subscribe, leave a comment with your location, and join this investigation, because what you're about to hear will haunt your sleep. The man who held Cato's life in his grip was Master Elijah Grayson, a planter who wore polished boots and quoted scripture, yet believed his slaves were property no different from oxen or tools. His family, a stern wife and 2 grown sons, mirrored his arrogance. Grayson was respected by neighbors, his reputation untarnished in polite society. He was known to give long speeches at church about duty and morality, his words dripping with righteousness. But behind the polished veneer lay cruelty. Slaves whispered of midnight beatings, of families torn apart on a whim, of children sold like cattle to cover gambling debts. To outsiders, the Graysons were pillars of Southern tradition. To those in the slave quarters, they were predators wearing masks of piety. And it wasn't just the lash that carved scars. It was the smug certainty that their victims' suffering didn't matter. That certainty would blind them, leaving them vulnerable to a form of vengeance they could never have imagined. On paper, the Graysons lived in a household of order and prosperity. The plantation accounts were clean, their crops bountiful, their workforce obedient, at least in appearance. When sickness or accidents claimed the lives of a few slaves, as often happened, Elijah Grayson would nod solemnly and say it was the Lord's will. If an overseer died suddenly, perhaps of fever or a snake bite in the field, it was written off as misfortune, the hazards of life in the humid South. These explanations soothed the anxieties of the white planter class. After all, what more logical culprit than nature itself? To suggest foul play from a slave, a creature they believed incapable of such cunning, was unthinkable. That blind faith in their own superiority created the perfect cover. Kato did not need to hide his vengeance behind fire or steel. He simply needed to let nature play its role while he guided it, carefully, patiently, with a precision his masters never suspected he possessed. The swamps near the Grayson plantation were thick with secrets. Cypress trees rose like ancient sentinels, their roots tangled in black water alive with movement. Cottonmouths, rattlesnakes, and spiders thrived there, creatures feared and despised by white planters who rarely stepped beyond the edges of cleared fields. But Cato had grown up knowing their patterns, their hiding places, their moods. He had learned which snakes struck fastest, which spiders carried venom that lingered in the blood. The swamp was not an enemy to him. It was a library, a laboratory, and eventually an armory. At night, while others slept fitfully in the quarters, Cato slipped into the darkness, barefoot, silent, harvesting nature's assassins. He kept them in woven baskets, jars sealed with cloth, hidden beneath floorboards and behind loose boards in the smokehouse. No overseer would dare reach into those places, for fear of what might be waiting. This was the infrastructure of his rebellion. Not muskets or torches, but fangs and venom gathered patiently, waiting for their moment. When the first signs appeared, no one thought much of it. A servant girl collapsed in the kitchen after a sudden bite, her skin flushed, her breathing ragged. The Graysons buried her quietly, blaming carelessness with the woodpile. Later, one of the sons woke in the night with swelling on his leg, as though something had bitten him in his sleep. The doctor was summoned, shaking his head about the dangers of swamp creatures. Remedies were given: poultices, bleeding, whiskey. But the mystery lingered. Still, Elijah Grayson dismissed it. Snakes and spiders were simply part of southern life, he said, an annoyance no different than mosquitoes or fevers. To his neighbors, the misfortunes were tragic but ordinary. Nature was cruel but impartial, or so they believed. They could not see the hand guiding these accidents, the deliberate choices that turned random bites into targeted vengeance. But no rebellion, however secretive, is waged entirely alone. Kato had an ally in Dinah, an older woman in the quarters, skilled in herbal medicine and midwifery. She knew the body's weaknesses, the herbs that could slow a heartbeat or ease a fever. When she began to notice the strange timing of the Graysons' misfortunes, she did not recoil in fear. Instead, she became a quiet enabler. She whispered warnings about which masters slept lightly, which locked their doors, which were careless in leaving windows open to the humid night. To the others, she spoke of omens, of ancestors who walked with them in the swamp. Her words masked her role, cloaking rebellion in the language of folklore. Dinah was not wielding snakes herself, but she sharpened Cato's blade, ensuring that each strike of venom landed where it would hurt most. The Graysons were not faceless villains in Cato's story. They were flesh and blood tyrants whose cruelty wore down the spirit of those they owned. Elijah Grayson's wife, Margaret, was known for her cold disdain, striking slaves with the handle of her parasol if they crossed her path. Their eldest son, Thomas, enjoyed hunting, and sometimes his prey was not animals. The younger, Samuel, fancied himself kinder, but his kindness was nothing more than neglect. He looked away as others suffered. The victims of this story were not only the Graysons themselves, but those enslaved beneath their roof. Each lashing, each child sold, each night of terror left wounds too deep to see. And so when venom found its way into the family's veins, it was not a random cruelty, but a ledger being balanced in blood. Every secret carries the risk of discovery. One humid night, as Cato returned from the swamp with a small basket writhing softly in his hands, he was seen. A boy, no older than 12, who tended the stables, caught sight of him. The child's eyes widened, not with malice, but with fear. He said nothing at first. But days later, when strange noises echoed from the Grayson household and rumors spread of unseen creatures in the night, the boy whispered what he had seen to another slave. That whisper traveled, twisting with each retelling. Soon, Kato was no longer just a man. He was a figure cloaked in shadow, a conjurer, someone who had harnessed the swamp's darkest powers. And with that whisper, his path became even more dangerous. Because now, it was not only the Graysons who might discover him, but his own people, torn between awe and fear. Now you have to understand. For a child, carrying a secret this heavy is like living with fire in the chest. The stable boy, who had seen Kato cradling that basket of serpents, began to change. He stuttered when spoken to, avoided eye contact, and woke screaming from nightmares he could not describe. Others in the quarters noticed, whispering about curses and conjure men, stories as old as the Middle Passage. When the boy's trembling confession finally reached the ears of an overseer, it was met with ridicule. Snakes in a basket? Spiders in the bedchamber? The overseer laughed, smacking the boy across the mouth for telling tales. Officially, nothing was wrong. Unofficially, the child was marked, isolated by fear, dismissed by authority, and left carrying the unbearable knowledge that death was creeping through the Grayson household, one bite at a time. The deaths could not go ignored for long. When Thomas Grayson's health faltered, his legs swollen grotesquely from a bite that no poultice could cure, the plantation called in a doctor from Charleston. The inquiry was swift and shallow, cloaked in medical jargon that comforted the white family, but rang hollow to the enslaved. The diagnosis? An unfortunate consequence of rural life. The doctor spoke of fevers, of the dangers of stagnant water, of the natural perils that stalked southern nights. Elijah Grayson nodded gravely, accepting the explanation without pressing further. To admit sabotage, to imagine a slave outwitting them, was an idea too dangerous to entertain. And so the inquiry became a performance, a staged ritual of denial, designed to keep the plantation's hierarchy intact. The truth lay coiled in the shadows, unacknowledged yet undeniable to those who lived closest to it. Still, the evidence could not be entirely hidden. Survivors bore the marks of their encounters. Samuel Grayson awoke one morning with his arm mottled in purple welts, his veins darkened as though ink had been spilled beneath his skin. Margaret's ankle swelled monstrously after a single unseen bite, forcing her to limp with a cane she despised. Their suffering was visible, grotesque, undeniable, and yet, in the parlors of Charleston society, the Graysons maintained their composure. To admit weakness was to surrender status. So, the stories were carefully managed. A snake beneath a bed, merely plantation gossip. Spiders in a bedchamber, nonsense from superstitious slaves. But in the quarters, whispers grew louder. They had seen the way Samuel's skin discolored, the way Margaret screamed in the night when pain seized her bones. They knew this was not chance. It was punishment delivered in silence, leaving scars not just on flesh, but on pride. This is where the story gets truly chilling. Cato's method was not reckless. It was precise. He studied his prey as carefully as his masters studied crop yields. He knew that a rattlesnake, when kept cool and hungry, struck with terrifying accuracy. He understood that certain spiders, if left in darkness, became restless, aggressive, eager to crawl toward warmth. He chose his moments with calculation, placing baskets where a hand would reach, slipping jars into rafters where the contents would tumble at the brush of a curtain. This was no simple act of revenge. It was strategy. And that is what made it terrifying, because what the Graysons feared most was not the bite itself, but the realization that an enslaved man had harnessed knowledge they neither respected nor understood. The natural world, which they dismissed as background noise to their empire of cotton, had been turned against them. And behind it all was Cato, silent, patient, unblinking, directing every strike with the certainty of a general leading an invisible army. Every story of terror needs a pursuer of truth, and in this tale, that figure was Josiah Turner, a young minister's son from Charleston. Now you have to understand, Josiah was no saint. He carried his own sins, debts from gambling, a weakness for drink, and a restless curiosity that often put him in places where polite society thought he didn't belong. But he also had something rare, a suspicion that the official stories being told by men like Elijah Grayson were half-truths at best, deliberate lies at worst. Drawn to the plantation under the guise of offering spiritual counsel, Josiah was really chasing whispers. He had heard talk in the taverns of an enslaved man who commanded snakes, who turned the swamp itself into a weapon. Where others laughed, Josiah listened. Where others dismissed it as superstition, he leaned closer. He was not motivated by compassion alone. He smelled a story that could elevate his name, perhaps even redeem him in the eyes of a society that considered him a failure. And so, flawed but relentless, Josiah became the unlikely hero who dared to follow the trail into the shadows. Josiah's method was subtle. By day, he spoke with the Graysons in parlors heavy with tobacco smoke, nodding along as they complained of fever and misfortune. By night, he wandered closer to the slave quarters, asking questions in hushed tones, pretending to share scraps of scripture while really seeking fragments of truth. He paid close attention to the marks on survivors' bodies, to the tremors in the stable boy's voice, to the strange baskets hidden beneath floorboards. "I want you to picture this," he later wrote in his journal. A parlor filled with wealthy men insisting on God's order, while outside their windows, a man in chains quietly orchestrated their destruction with creatures they could not control. Josiah pieced together details others ignored. The timing of deaths, the recurring swellings, the way fear spread faster than infection. Slowly, dangerously, he began to see a pattern, and that pattern pointed to one name, Kato. Now let's be real. At this point, the story turns truly chilling. You followed me this far, and I have to ask, can you handle what comes next? Because what Josiah discovered in those nights would confirm every whispered fear, and once you know it, you cannot unknow it. If you're with me, take a moment, subscribe to Echoes of Truth, leave a comment with the words, "I'm still here," and let me know you're brave enough to keep going. This is more than history. This is a descent into the kind of vengeance that crawls under your skin, a vengeance that waits until you close your eyes. If you stay, you'll see what Josiah saw, the evidence that shifted this tale from rumor into undeniable reality. Are you ready? Josiah's breakthrough did not come under the scorching sun of the cotton fields, where sweat blurred his vision and the overseer's whip cracked like thunder. No, it arrived in the suffocating darkness of a humid summer night, when the quarters creaked with restless bodies and the air itself seemed to cling like damp cloth. He followed a whisper, half overheard between breaths, a fragment of warning not meant for his ears. Drawn by equal parts dread and curiosity, Josiah crept across the dirt yard until he reached a leaning shed near the smokehouse. The hinges groaned as he eased the door, and at once he froze. A sound, faint, steady, unmistakable, filled the silence. A low, rhythmic rustling, as though the shadows themselves were alive. Lifting his lantern with a trembling hand, Josiah cast light into the gloom. What he saw defied reason. Lined along the rough wooden walls were baskets and jars, their contents shifting with eerie life. In one corner, coiled cottonmouths rose, tongues flickering like shards of lightning in the flame's glow. Their scales glistened with oily menace, heads poised as if already judging the trespasser. Along a shelf, thick glass jars rattled softly as spiders the size of a man's hand clung to the insides, their legs twitching in frantic irritation at the sudden intrusion of light. The shed was no mere storage place. It was a hidden armory, a living arsenal of venom and terror, assembled in silence beneath the noses of unsuspecting masters. Josiah's breath caught in his throat, his chest hammering with each realization. This was no accident, no random cruelty of nature slipping into human spaces. Every container, every writhing inhabitant had been gathered with purpose. The implication was undeniable. Intent, rebellion, vengeance that slithered and crawled. His grip faltered, nearly dropping the lantern, the flame sputtering dangerously, as though it too feared this revelation. The musky odor of reptiles hung thick in the air, mingled with the faint, rasping scratch of spider legs against glass. In that moment, one truth became seared into Josiah's mind. Cato had harnessed nature itself, molding it into a weapon of war, and no denial, no fabricated explanation could ever cover the terror of what Josiah had just uncovered. But discoveries of this kind, you must understand, never stay hidden for long. Secrets have a way of breathing, of pressing against the walls meant to contain them until they spill into the open. That very night, before Josiah could steady his racing thoughts, his presence in the shed was detected. At first, it was nothing more than a groan of aged wood beneath weight, the kind of sound one might dismiss as the shifting of timbers. But then came the shadow, stretching across the doorway, black against the faint spill of lantern light. In an instant, the balance shifted. The intruder became the exposed, the observer became the observed. The hunted, in that moment, was no longer the venom bottled in jars. It was Josiah himself. Kato emerged from the darkness, silent as if conjured by the very creatures he had mastered. His face, caught in flickering light, betrayed no fury, no fear, only unreadable calm, a stillness more terrifying than rage. Their eyes met, locking in a wordless battle. Josiah's gaze was frantic, pleading for understanding, while Cato's carried the weight of survival, of knowledge too dangerous to surrender. The silence shattered when Josiah stumbled backward, his heel striking a shelf. A jar toppled and burst, glass splintering across the floor. From its wreckage, a massive spider burst free, scuttling across the boards with terrifying speed, its legs scratching like tiny knives. Panic seized him. Instinct overruled reason, and Josiah bolted, lantern swinging wildly as he burst into the humid night. The air outside wrapped around him like wet cloth, suffocating, but still, he ran. His heartbeat thundered louder than the chorus of cicadas, louder than the desperate rasp of his breath. And always behind him lingered the dread of pursuit. He swore he heard Cato's footsteps closing in, though perhaps it was only the hiss of the swamp, mocking his fear. Branches clawed at his arms, mud clutched at his boots, and every shadow seemed alive. Each second stretched into eternity, a nightmare without end. By the time he collapsed at the field's edge, lungs ablaze and body trembling, one truth settled into his bones. He had escaped with his life, yes, but never again would he know the certainty of safety. When Josiah returned to Charleston, he did not return as the same man who had set out across the marshes. His clothes were torn, his body marked with scratches and bruises. But it was his eyes that betrayed the deepest wounds. They were wild, unsteady, as though they had glimpsed something the human mind was not meant to witness. He carried with him more than the marks of a harrowing escape. He carried a story, heavy and dangerous, a story that if spoken too loudly could topple reputations and unravel illusions carefully guarded by polite society. He told of jars packed with monstrous spiders, their legs tapping in glass prisons. He spoke of serpents coiled in baskets, stored like soldiers waiting for release. Most chilling of all, he described Cato himself, not as a man beaten down by slavery, but as a commander of nature, wielding scales and fangs as though they were blades forged for war. But instead of admiration for his bravery in bringing back such revelations, Josiah met only walls of resistance. The reaction was not horror at Cato's supposed acts, but rather unease at Josiah's suggestion that such intelligence, such cunning, could exist in a man they considered property. To admit this possibility was to admit weakness in the entire institution of slavery, a fragility they dared not expose. Planters sneered behind polished glasses of brandy, dismissing him with nervous laughter. Physicians, cloaked in the authority of science, waved him off as fevered and delirious. Ministers warned him sternly against spreading ungodly rumors, urging him to remember his place and his reputation. The same parlors that once welcomed him with warmth now turned their backs, whispering that Josiah had lost his mind among the swamps. And yet, silence did not still him. The truth gnawed at his conscience like a relentless insect, refusing to be buried beneath ridicule. In private, Josiah scrawled his terror into journals. "I have seen the swamp's army. It is real, it waits, and it will not stop." Those words, ignored in his lifetime, would one day resurface long after the Graysons' names faded into obscurity, standing as one of the only written testimonies that a man once chained had dared to wield fear itself as his weapon. It was inevitable. Whispers, after all, have a way of spreading, seeping under doors and across fields until they demand attention. Once Josiah's testimony reached beyond the confines of hushed conversations, pressure swelled for an official response. The Graysons, already weakened by sickness, scandal, and sleepless nights filled with dread, could no longer dismiss the rumors as madness or accident. With their pride wavering and their authority slipping, they summoned the county militia, hoping that armed men might restore the illusion of control. And so, on a sweltering afternoon, heavy with the stench of summer, the sound of boots thundered across the plantation. Muskets glinted in the sun, sabers clattered against belts, and dogs strained at their leashes as the men advanced. The house, once a monument to wealth and order, now trembled under their assault. Floorboards that had groaned under generations of silence suddenly resounded with the weight of exposure. What the militia uncovered was nothing short of a chamber of horrors. Beneath loose planks, behind false walls, and tucked in shadowed corners, they discovered proof, not rumor, not superstition, but undeniable reality. Glass jars quivered with massive spiders, their hairy legs scraping against the glass in desperate irritation. Baskets writhed with venomous snakes, cottonmouths, and rattlers striking at the wicker walls as if eager for release. Crude tools, fashioned for the careful handling of such creatures, lay scattered like surgical instruments of a grotesque science. Hardened overseers, men accustomed to brutality, recoiled at the sight. Some crossed themselves instinctively, muttering prayers, while others spat curses, as though naming the devil himself might banish the terror before their eyes. This was no fever dream, no tale spun by a frightened imagination. The evidence hissed, slithered, and twit, yet in front of them, undeniable and alive. And yet, as the militia herded the enslaved into the yard, demanding answers, one figure was conspicuously absent. Kato, the man whose name had become both curse and legend, was nowhere to be found. His bed lay empty, his few belongings left untouched, as though he had evaporated into the swamp air. To some, he was a fugitive. To others, he had transcended into specter, a spirit destined to return. The raid confirmed one thing above all: the fear was real, and it would never again be erased. With the raid came the unmasking, though not in the way polite society or even history would later choose to remember it. Elijah Grayson and his family, once hailed as polished examples of Southern gentility, suddenly stood revealed as something they had never allowed themselves to appear: vulnerable, shaken, and very much afraid. The mansion that had once symbolized wealth and order was now whispered about in neighboring plantations as a place where serpents slithered under bedsheets and spiders nested in closets. The whispers spread like wildfire. People spoke of women waking in terror, believing they felt legs crawling across their skin. They spoke of children too afraid to slip their feet into boots, fearing what might be waiting in the dark leather. For a planter class that prided itself on absolute control over land, over nature, over human lives, nothing was more humiliating than the suggestion that their own enslaved laborers had outwitted them, using the very creatures they feared most. Elijah Grayson, red-faced and brimming with rage, tried desperately to reclaim authority. He shouted to neighbors, to militia officers, to ministers that this was all nonsense, a cruel trick of the swamp. Nature's curse, he called it, blaming the feverish air, the rising insects, anything but the possibility of human cunning. Yet, denial is a fragile shield when set against undeniable evidence. The swollen limbs of servants and family members alike bore witness to bites and stings no prayer could explain away. Festering wounds, blackened veins, and the jars filled with venomous proof spoke louder than Elijah's protests ever could. Stripped of their mask of invulnerability, the Graysons found themselves pushed to the fringes of the very society they once ruled. Invitations dwindled, whispers sharpened, and what had been admiration turned into ridicule, even pity, but humiliation did not loosen their grip on power. Even in disgrace, the Graysons clung stubbornly to silence, refusing to acknowledge that Cato had orchestrated it all. Their refusal spoke volumes, for in their silence, their greatest fear bled through, that others might believe the story, that others might be inspired, and that the balance of terror might shift forever. I want you to picture this. Cato's story did not remain bound within the fences of one plantation, or even within the borders of a single county. Stories, especially those drenched in fear, have wings of their own. Whispers crept across fields and dirt roads, carried in the hushed conversations of traders and overseers, repeated by dock workers who lingered too long in Charleston's markets, and murmured by sailors who thrived on tales that made the long nights at sea bearable. Each retelling added its own flavor. Some swore Cato could command snakes with a word. Others claimed he had struck deals with spirits of the swamp. Yet at the heart of every version, one truth remained. A man in chains had turned nature itself into a weapon. Soon, those whispers leapt the Atlantic winds, borne aboard ships sailing south toward the Caribbean. And there, among islands still scarred by uprisings like Hades, the tale found fertile soil. To the enslaved, it was legend. Proof that resistance could take a shape their oppressors could never anticipate. No swords, no muskets, no flames, only the silent patience of venom and fangs. To the planter class, however, Cato's name became something else entirely, a cautionary tale. In grand houses along the waterfront, parents frightened their children into obedience with warnings of the Venom man who lurked in the swamps, waiting for the careless. The archives, though fragmented and incomplete, still carry echoes of his shadow. Letters and ledgers contain cryptic phrases, mentions of unnatural methods, warnings about a conjurer of venom. Though never explained outright, these fragments betray the nervousness of men trying to discuss the unmentionable without admitting its reality. Even in code, the fear is palpable. One man, with one plan, had unsettled an entire system designed to appear unshakable. Imagine the terror of knowing that wealth, reputation, and even armed guards could not protect you from the bite of a creature small enough to slip under your door. Cato had proven something dangerous, that the foundations of control were far more brittle than those in power dared to admit. And once that idea took root, No wall of silence could contain it. But history, as you know, is rarely written by the bold. More often, it is shaped and carefully edited by the fearful. The story of Cato, if we are to call it a rebellion, was never given the dignity of official recognition. Instead, it was smothered beneath layers of omission, redaction, and deliberate silence. Court transcripts that should have detailed testimonies break off mid-sentence, as if someone tore the pages from the record. Plantation ledgers skip entire seasons without explanation, leaving gaps wide enough to hide 100 truths. And the few surviving testimonies, Josiah's frantic journal among them, were dismissed by scholars and society alike, catalogued as oddities, curiosities, or at best, fevered exaggerations. Why such precision in silence? Because to acknowledge Kato was to acknowledge fragility. It was to admit that a man, shackled in body, had found a way to strike terror into those who believed themselves unshakable. And so, the conspiracy of silence began. Preachers from the pulpit warned congregations against African superstition, urging the faithful to see snakes and spiders as mere symbols of temptation rather than as weapons of rebellion. Newspapers, when they dared to mention the incidents at all, framed them as tragic accidents or as evidence of divine punishment, twisting fear into narratives that absolved masters of responsibility. Even among the enslaved, whispers were tamped down. Overseers and patrollers did not only police movements, they policed speech. A careless word about Kato could bring the lash, or worse. Fear spread in both directions. Fear of what Kato represented, and fear of what would happen if anyone admitted he existed at all. This silence was not just about erasing one man, it was about protecting an illusion. The illusion that the system of slavery was absolute, immovable, ordained. If one enslaved man could bend nature itself into a weapon, what did that say about the future? Could others follow? Could the balance shift? Those questions once asked could never be unasked, and so it was easier, safer, to bury the truth and pretend the venom had never dripped in the first place. What became of them all? That is the question history prefers to leave unanswered, but fragments give us glimpses. The Graysons, once a family of standing and wealth, found themselves hollowed out by scandal and sickness. Their decline was not sudden, but slow, drawn out, and humiliating, the kind of fall that lingers in whispers rather than headlines. Elijah Grayson, the proud patriarch who had once boasted of his mastery over land and people alike, succumbed in 1812. His body, wasted and ravaged by infection, was said to stink of rot even before the grave claimed him. His estate, once vast and fertile, was divided among creditors, each acre chipped away as though the land itself refused to remain in Grayson hands. Margaret survived longer, but life never let her forget. The limp she carried after her encounter with Venom became permanent, her cane's sharp click echoing down hallways like a mocking reminder of the power she had underestimated. To those who visited, her presence was haunting. A woman who had lost both her beauty and her composure, bound forever to the memory of a creature she could not control. Thomas's fate was no better. The leg he once injured never healed, swelling and aching until death. Neighbors whispered that the venom had cursed him, a poison that lived on in his blood. Samuel, the one who once displayed flashes of kindness, drowned in his own despair. Drink claimed him, and with each cup, whatever humanity he once possessed slipped away. Josiah Turner, the flawed truth-seeker, endured, though his survival came with its own price. Society branded him mad, his journals dismissed as ravings of a fevered imagination. They were locked away, unpublished, their value recognized only generations later. And Kato? Here lies the deepest mystery, the final silence history cannot break. Some claim he fled into the swamps, where he was swallowed by mud and mist, living and dying among the creatures he had mastered. Others whisper he escaped north, carrying his knowledge into secret networks, careful never to place his name on paper. To this day, his fate remains unknown, and perhaps that uncertainty is what keeps his story alive, haunting every retelling. This is where the story lingers, refusing to fade even when the names of its players blur into dust. Cato's tale, when stripped of its layers of rumor and exaggeration, is not simply about snakes and spiders. It is about something far larger, far more enduring. It is about defiance, raw, unyielding, and born in the crucible of desperation. Imagine, if you will, a man stripped of every recognized human right, denied freedom, denied dignity, denied even ownership of his own body. And yet, within those chains, he carved out a weapon that was his alone. He found a way to strike terror into the hearts of those who had believed themselves untouchable, untarnished, above the reach of fear itself. His weapons were not forged of steel, nor were they purchased with coin or crafted in secret workshops. They were forged in silence, in patience, in the dark knowledge of the swamp. They slithered, they crawled, they carried venom instead of firepower. In his hands, creatures dismissed as nuisances or nightmares became instruments of rebellion. That is the unsettling brilliance of his legacy, a reminder that revolt does not always roar in the streets with drums and banners. Sometimes it creeps, quiet as breath. Sometimes it slithers into the places where the oppressor feels safest, beneath blankets, into boots, across pillows. And sometimes it waits, patient as hunger, until the moment comes when eyes close in the trust of sleep, and judgment is delivered. The moral, if one dares to draw it, is a chilling one. Desperation breeds innovation. Oppression, no matter how absolute it seems, plants the seeds of its own undoing. The greater the injustice, the sharper and more unexpected the rebellion it inspires. In silence, in shadows, even those deemed powerless can tilt the balance of fear. That is why Cato's story endures. It is not just a relic of the past, but a mirror held to the present. It unsettles us because it whispers a question we are not eager to answer. What happens when the voiceless find new ways to make themselves heard? So now, I leave you with a question. One that lingers long after the story itself has faded into silence. Could something like this happen today? Could a person, pressed to the edge of desperation, turn to the natural world not as shelter, but as weapon? Would we even recognize it if vengeance wore the face of nature instead of man? That, perhaps, is the most unsettling part of Cato's legacy. His story, whether rooted in fact or polished by folklore, is more than a fragment of history. It is a mirror, one held up to the fragility of power, exposing just how thin the veil of control can be when survival demands cunning. It forces us to confront the ingenuity born of suffering, the strange innovations that emerge when one human being is denied everything, yet refuses to surrender completely. Cato's name may be swallowed in the gaps of official records, his face lost to time, but his story continues to press on our imagination. It raises the possibility that the past still echoes in the present, that resistance may take forms we are unprepared to see. Tell me, in the comments below, do you believe Cato was a man of flesh and blood, leaving behind venom and scars as proof of his rebellion? Or was he a legend carefully stitched together by whispers, a specter designed to haunt the guilty and unsettle the powerful? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, in that strange territory where myth and memory overlap. If you followed me this far into the shadows, I invite you deeper. Subscribe to Echoes of Truth, if you dare, because this is only one chapter in a series of stories the world has tried to bury. And as for what comes next, well, let's just say it begins not with a swamp, but with a locked room. A body vanishes, leaving behind no trace but a trail of blood smeared across the floor, blood no one was supposed to see. The walls hold secrets, the silence holds lies. Are you ready to follow me there?